It is good to be with you tonight for this holy occasion, this Holy Week observance of Maundy Thursday, and especially to return to church for this after a forced pandemic has caused us to be absent on these occasions for the last couple of years. Several years, a book came out titled The Last Lecture. It was written by Randy Pausch with assistance from Wall Street Journal writer and author Jeffrey Zaslow. Anyone heard of that book before? The Last Lecture? A couple. The Last Lecture was based on an actual lecture Pausch, a professor of computer science and human-computer interaction, had delivered at Carnegie Mellon University in 2007, a lecture which was posted to YouTube and which you can still watch. As Randy Pausch explained in his book, the last lecture had become a common exercise on college campuses. Professors, he wrote, are asked to consider their demise and to ruminate on what matters most to them. While they speak, Pausch notes, audiences can't help but mull on the same question. What wisdom would we impart to the world if we knew it was our last chance? If we had to vanish tomorrow, what would we want as our legacy? Carnegie Mellon had sponsored a Last Lecture series for years, but it's probably fair to say that the last lecture delivered by Randy Pausch is the most well-known of their entire series. When Randy Pausch was asked to deliver his last lecture, he had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And by the time he actually delivered his last lecture on September 18, 2007, he had 10 tumors on his liver. He had been told that there was no further treatment available to him and that he had only a few months to live. Randy Pausch titled his last lecture, quote, "Really Achieving Your Childhood Dreams." It was attended by over 400 students, faculty, friends, and guests of Pausch's in an auditorium at Carnegie Mellon. While he delivered his last lecture at Carnegie Mellon, the university audience was not his real target audience. He makes this clear in the introduction to the book. Quote, "Under the ruse of giving an academic lecture, I was trying to put myself in a bottle that would one day wash up on the beach for my children. I lectured about the joy of life, about how much I appreciated life even with so little of my own left. I talked about honesty, integrity, gratitude, and other things I hold dear." At the end of the last lecture itself, he said to the audience, "This lecture was not really for you. It's for my children." Toward the very end of the book, in a chapter titled "Dreams for My Children," Pausch wrote, "There are so many things I want to tell my children, and right now they're too young to understand. Dylan just turned 6, Logan is 3, and Chloe is 18 months old. I want the kids to know who I am, what I've always believed in, and all the ways in which I've come to love them." What incredible foresight, and what a full and gracious gift to those he held precious, to those he loved. The Last Supper is Jesus' last lecture. This is his final opportunity to convey to his followers who he is, what he believes in, what matters most to him, and the ways he has come to love them. Imagine what it was like to be at Jesus' last lecture. There was the meal itself, a Passover meal according to the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John portrays the meal as occurring a day earlier, on the day of preparation when the Passover lambs were slaughtered, but it is a Passover context nonetheless. Passover was and is the defining observance for Judaism, and we heard that narrative in the reading from Exodus this evening. It's a highly symbolic meal freighted with significance, during which Jews remember God's saving act that made them a people and actually relive and re-experience that act again to recognize the ongoingness of that saving event. God's saving act in which God led them out of the bondage of slavery in Egypt. Jesus took the bread of the Passover meal and reinterpreted its meaning. This is my body, he says to his followers. And likewise the cup after the meal, which he reinterpreted as his blood given for them. In this reinterpretation, Jesus is not only establishing a practice that will become ritual for his followers down through the ages, our Eucharist, he's also underscoring its significance. This meal and the events connected with it, his crucifixion and resurrection, are to be understood for all time as God's new saving event for all people, as the new Passover for those who would be his followers. Strangely, John doesn't describe the meal in his gospel, at least not overtly. In John's gospel, Jesus is not portrayed as taking the bread and the wine and reinterpreting them and giving them to his disciples. This doesn't mean that John doesn't teach about the Eucharistic meal. He certainly does. John teaches about it in chapter 6 of his gospel when Jesus says, I am the bread of life. John teaches about it in chapter 15 when Jesus says, I am the true vine. Instead of the institution of the Last Supper, however, recounted not only in the three so-called synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but also by Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians, we heard that recounting tonight, John's Gospel looks at a different dimension of that night, at a different dimension of Jesus' last lecture. Dinner ends. Jesus gets up from the table, takes off his outer robe, ties a towel around himself, and washes his disciples' feet. It catches them by surprise, this act of his. It makes them uncomfortable. Peter gives voice to this. Well, Peter was always ready to blurt out what others were thinking. Lord, are you going to wash my feet? It wasn't so much a question as it was an objection. Peter felt it was beneath Jesus to do such a thing, that it was undignified. After all, it was Peter who had confessed Jesus to be the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one, the new king. What kind of king is this? Disrobing and kneeling down and taking his disciples' feet, their filthy feet, which only sandal shod had traipsed from Bethany to Jerusalem on roads of dirt and dung. After he had done this, after he had washed their feet, he put on his robe and returned to his seat. He said to them, do you know what I have just done to you? You call me your teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set an example that you also should do as I have done to you. I imagine they were puzzled. I suspect that they had the experience but missed the meaning, to use a phrase of the great Anglo-American poet T.S. Eliot. Later, after Jesus had died, after he had been crucified and buried, and above all, after he had been raised, they would recall his words and actions in reflective solitude. They would recall his last lecture. They would grasp the meaning, and they would follow in his way. He said many things to them that night at his Last Supper, at his last lecture. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Imagine needing to be commanded to love. They must have thought to one another. But then as they considered the times they had quarreled, had jockeyed for position and favor from him, as they considered the times they had been petty and trite and stupid, well, they would get it. They would understand, as many husbands and wives and parents and siblings understand, that there are times when we need to be commanded to love. Sometimes it's the command to love that gets us through the valleys of domestic conflict and through the valleys of any conflict. Do not let your hearts be troubled, he said to them that night in his last lecture. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go and prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. Lord, we do not know where you're going. How can we know the way? Thomas said to him that night at that last lecture. I am the way, the truth, and the life, Jesus had answered him. No one comes to the Father except through me. And similarly, they must have wondered what he meant by that. And over the ages, too many Christians would apply a kind of mechanical, narrow application to that saying of Jesus, making it an exclusive rule for admission into heaven instead of understanding it in the broader context of the last lecture and the passion and the commandment to serve and to love, to understand that Jesus is the way and the truth and the life, precisely through the depth of his love for all people, the sick, the sinful, the brokenhearted. Instead of understanding that the salvation of his followers was integrally tied to their capacity to love one another just as radically, just as unconditionally as he had done. Jesus had many other things to say in that last lecture. It's Jesus' final opportunity to convey to his followers then and down through the ages who he is, what he believes in, what matters most to him, and the ways he's come to love them. It is his last opportunity to urge them to carry on his love, his deep, sacrificial, costly love, not only to them, to one another, but to the world. And let's face it, the world today is desperately in need of this kind of love. Tonight and over the next couple of days, it is our solemn task to meditate and reflect upon Jesus' last lecture and his last days. As we do this, we should mull over what meaning these have for us. What is the meaning and lasting legacy of Jesus in us, who are his followers today? If we had to witness to our own last lecture as Christians, to our children, to our friends and family and colleagues, if we were to try to put ourselves in a bottle which we hope would wash up on the beach at a later day for them, as Randy Posh tried to do for his children, how would we make clear what we believe in, what we hold dear, who and how we loved? What wisdom would we impart to the world if we knew it was our last chance, if we had to vanish tomorrow? What would we want our legacy to be? Tonight and the next couple of days are a fitting time for us to consider Jesus' last lecture, to consider Jesus as the saving event of God for us and for the world. And it's a fitting time for us to consider our own last lecture and perhaps how well it merges with his and how we live it out in the world.